Okay. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
Hi, Douglas. I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you with us. Let's see. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. Your bio has got a lot of information, which I doubt we'll be able to get through all of it in our 15 minutes that we're going to be on. But we'll do our best to give a good overview. Obviously, you're promoting your book called The Science of Hate. It says that you're the founder and director of Hate Lab. Can you explain what you do at Hate Lab?
Sure. Hate Lab is a non-profit that works out of Cardiff University in the UK. And we basically use the type of AI that the tech giants use to detect online hate speech that manifests around events like terror attacks, political votes, and so on. And we then use that technology to hold them to account in many ways. So we speak to Twitter, TikTok, Facebook quite frequently, and we talk to them about the hate speech that we identify. And we also empower civil society organizations to do the same. So, these organizations don't have the vast wealth of the big tech giants. So ultimately, we empower them by democratizing this kind of technology amongst them. And hopefully it helps in some way to hold the social media giants to account.
For the sake of this conversation, can you define what hate speech is?
Of course, it depends on jurisdiction. So it'll depend on whether the US, the UK, or another country. And each state in the US has different laws, and we have our own set of laws in the UK. So it does really depend on where you're at. But ultimately, the way we define it in the lab is to identify hate speech that is in some way antagonistic based on a recipient's identity. So it's not just offensive; it has to be grossly offensive. So it's when someone is homophobic, racist, anti-Semitic, but that level of prejudice is quite extreme. So it's not merely offensive. So we do toe. We're very careful to toe the line of what is free speech, freedom of expression, and what is hate speech.
Does hate speech have to incite violence against a particular group?
Not necessarily. In our estimations, it can be non-insightful, so it can just be grossly offensive and derogatory. But of course, we do pick up hate speech that is insightful. So hate speech that calls for violence against certain groups. And we've seen a lot of that type of hate speech, actually. It is the most serious type of hate speech. And there is a link between that type of hate speech and hate on the streets. We've seen that frequently in the UK, in Germany, and in the US. Actually, there's some very convincing studies that have been done that show that link between what happens online and what's actually happening on the streets.
According to your bio, it says that 20 years ago you were the victim of a hate crime. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so 20 years ago, I was victimized because of my sexual orientation. I had just finished my degree in sociology and I was spending time with friends in London. And I was outside a gay bar, and I was set upon by three men, and they physically attacked me to the point that I fell to the ground, had a split lip. I knew it was a homophobic attack because of the homophobic slurs that they were using during the commission of the attack. At the time, I didn't report it to the police. There was no law at that time, actually, that protected gay people from that kind of attack, specifically a hate crime law. And it changed my life. I ended up changing my career because of it. I had burning questions in my head that I just couldn't answer with the knowledge that I had, and that led me to do a degree in criminology. And then my whole career was spent doing criminology. Spent the last 20 years actually studying the phenomenon of hate to try and understand why my attackers chose me that day. I still don't know why they chose me that day. I haven't been able to speak to them. Obviously, I would love to be able to speak to them now and have a conversation with them about why they did what they did and whether or not they regret what they did. And to have found them in the course of writing the book would have been wonderful, but that just simply wasn't possible. But what I did discover in that 20 years was more generally speaking why hate crime happens. How a prejudice can tip over into hate crime in certain groups of individuals.
Well, I am sorry to hear that happened to you. Were these individuals prosecuted or no?
No, not to my knowledge, because I never reported it. The reason I didn't report it, number one, was because there was no specific hate crime that I could report, but I could have reported the assault, of course, as a separate offence. But at the time as well, I didn't have that much trust in police. I as a gay man, knew of a history of the relationship between the gay population, gay communities, and policing wasn't great. There was lots of cases of entrapment where police would entrap gay men and arrest them. And so I didn't have the confidence in the police that I needed to make that report. I actually thought I could have been subject to secondary victimization if I did report the offence to the police. So I didn't have the confidence to do that. And my experiences, I think, is reflected in others' experience. So if we're to look in the States, for example, why so many hate crimes go unreported is partly because of the marred relationship between communities that are frequently victimized and the police that are meant to protect them. So that relationship, I think, is partly responsible for the low numbers of hate crimes we're seeing in the police statistics in the US.
You mentioned that after this attack that you changed your career and you started working in criminology. One of your talking points that I want to hit, it says, we know that there are sociological reasons why people commit hate crimes, but you also claim, I assume in the book, that there are biological reasons as well? So are you suggesting that there is a hate gene, perhaps?
I'm not,
Okay.
but we can't ignore biology when we talk of behavior. So if we were to, there's a very famous neuroscientist called Robert Sapolsky out of Stanford, who's a great influence on me, and his argument has always been that our behaviors are primarily driven by biological forces and hormonal responses and so on and so forth. I don't go as far as Sapolsky does in saying that our hateful responses are primarily driven by our biology, but they do play a part. So, for example, we're not born hating, we're not born prejudiced. We learn prejudice and we learn hatred. That's there's no question about that. But we are born with brains that prefer or make us prefer in some ways to be part of a group and part of an in-group. And that in-group can manifest as anything. It can be manifest in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. But ultimately, we like being parts of groups. So we're a very groupish species. And that's basically an evolutionary trait. The reason we're like that is because when we found out that cooperation would ensure the survival of our species, we did it more, and only those that cooperated survived. Those that didn't cooperate died out. So ultimately, our brains formed into this way, and ultimately, what this means is that we love being a part of a group. But of course, when you're in a group, there's always somebody outside of that group, and this is where we get what we call the in-group, us, and the out-group, them. And the in and out group is a fundamental part of how we understand prejudice and eventually hatred. Now, being part of an in-group isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing malignant about that, but it can be weaponized and it can be hacked, if you like. The brain can be hacked. And that's in terms of understanding the out-group as a potential threat. So if the out-group that was just kind of sitting there at one point, managing its own business, wasn't really doing anything to us at all, and we were ignoring it. But as soon as that out-group becomes a threat, or we perceive it to become a threat, and we could be told it's a threat by, say, for example, a nefarious politician might say, this group are a threat, you need to be aware of them, you need to vote for me so I can get rid of them. That's when prejudices start to form. That's when the seeds of hatred might germinate. But that's not necessarily something we're born with, if you see what I mean. We have to learn that through exposure to culture, exposure to those nefarious politicians, and so on.
Well, I was going to bring up that point. You presumpted me just slightly there, where you said with politics, because politics seems to have been more recently than previously sort of weaponized in that regard, where there is such a political divide. I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the United States, it's the most divided politically that I've seen it in my life. And I'm 61 years old this year. There was always rivalry between the two Republican and Democrat parties, but it was far more civilized than it was in the last 10 years. So it brings me to your other talking point where it says, is the present day the most hateful time that the world has ever experienced? I would say no. I just would say that it's more amplified now because of social media and instant news and all of that. What is your opinion of that?
I completely agree with you. It's a really tricky question to answer. It's impossible to answer, actually, because it's all about measurement, and we haven't been measuring hate for long enough to know if there's more of it now than ever before. But I think what we can say sort of quantitatively is that social media amplifies hatred in a way that we've not seen in the past, obviously, because social media has only been here for 15 years. And so what I would say is hate is now potentially more insidious on a global scale than it ever has been. That's because social media is 24/7 media. It's almost impossible to escape the rhetoric on social media. I always use the example of a kid in school. I mean, I was a kid in the 80s and I was bullied in school. But I could always escape the bullies by coming home. The sanctity of the home, the safe harbor of the home, was a place where I could forget about the bullies for a period of time, evenings and weekends, school holidays. That doesn't happen anymore. Social media is basically means that the kids who are being bullied generally, or for an aspect of their identity, are suffering 24/7. They're on Snapchat, they're on TikTok, they're on Twitter, they're on text and WhatsApp, and they're being bombarded with this stuff in a way that we never experienced as young people. And it's having a huge impact on the mental health of our younger generations. There's now evidence emerging in the US and in Europe that links excessive use of social media to mental health problems in young people, and this is associated with hatred as well. So ultimately, what we're seeing is an epidemic of sorts, I think, of mental health issues caused by social media, which is linked in partly to hatred, and so this makes me conclude that modern times are very, very different in terms of how hate is communicated compared to the past. And so I think we have to acknowledge that, and it's a significant issue that we're still to get a grip of.
What is the takeaway from your book? Is there any sort of happy ending? I hate to use that term, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very hopeful person because I have to be. You can't study this subject for 20 years and not be a hopeful person, because I'd probably go nuts. And an important point I make in the book is that while it focuses on a very dark subject and it goes through lots of case studies of hate crimes and in quite some detail, when we observe hate speech on social media and we look at hate crimes on the streets, they're only perpetrated by a small minority. If you look at a percentage on social media, 99.9% of the conversations that we monitor are healthy conversations. They're not hateful. So we're talking about a very small proportion of people that are perpetrating these bad behaviors. Doesn't mean we should pay it less attention. We should pay it a lot of attention because they can cause an inordinate and a disproportionate amount of damage. But at the same time, I think just to keep a healthy perspective, we can recognize that ultimately, the majority of people are actually quite decent citizens, and that keeps me going. And the book then ends actually on what I call the 7 steps to stop hate, which is ultimately a list of activities people can do to challenge their own prejudices and fears, but also challenge those in others as well.
Well, Matthew, we do have to wind this down. Thank you so much for coming on. My guest is Matthew Williams. The book is called The Science of Hate. The book is available now?
It is available now, yes, from all good retailers.
Okay. And last question, do you have a website that you want to give out?
Yeah, sure. Folks can visit thescienceofhate.com if they want to learn more.
Okay. Thank you again, and best of luck with your book. I hope it does well.
Thank you very much, Douglas.